This is a Viva PR podcast.
He said that the main skill he's had to develop over the years is to become a good storyteller. Practice makes permanent. And I think curiosity is a wonderful trait to develop. If the average 18-year-old continues to behave in the way that they're behaving now, these are the number of dots that will be filled with looking at a screen.
Hello and welcome to PR in the Real World, a public relations podcast from Lancashire's leading agency, Viva PR. I'm your host, Tony Garner, and I've run Viva now for 22 years, and we've had plenty of ups and downs along the way. When we were thinking about what podcast can we put out into the world that's not already been there, we decided we'd give it a proper Lancashire spin and really look at what makes our world different than perhaps the kind of world of London PR. And today we're really excited to have a guest who I've known over the years. I'm really excited that he's made the trip up to Rosendale from deepest, darkest Cheshire. Today we're going to be talking about verbal PR, how you kind of project yourself verbally and how important that is. So welcome, Andrew Thorp.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's great to be here.
I'll let you talk about how you got here, because that in itself is an interesting journey. But Andrew is an experienced podcaster, so I might learn some tips of him. And he's got a rich background in communication. He's got 3 TED Talks to his name and now hosts TEDx Warrington regularly. But it all started in a semi-pro golf career. And now he's moved on from that into a public speaking and has helped members of the European Parliament. Really unique career, really unique experiences. So let's cut to the chase and find out, where did it all start? How have you got to where you are today?
Well, I'll pick up on one thing you said, Tony, because you said you've been running Viva for 22 years. And that's the length of time I worked in the golf industry for, 22 years. How about that? So my brother's a professional golfer, 10 years older than me. I grew up in Lytham St Anne's. So with those 2 factors in play, then it's inevitable that I learned to play golf. So golf was a huge part of my life growing up. And I wanted to follow in his footsteps and become a pro myself. But you mentioned I was a semi-pro, which indicates I wasn't quite good enough, which is true. I was never really good enough to play golf for a living, but I did teach for a while and I worked in a number of roles. I was a journalist for a while in the golf industry. I used to run commercial golf and leisure clubs, and I refereed in the Ryder Cup, which was a great thrill.
Wow.
And that was because I worked for the PGA, the Professional Golfers Association, at the Belfry for 4 years. But then in the late noughties, it was around 2008 when we had the financial crash around the world. I was involved in a business partnership that didn't really work out. It had nothing to do with the financial crash. It was just purely coincidental timing. But it left me in a tight spot, and a number of other things went wrong in my life. So that was my dark period. And I decided I was going to reinvent myself and restart my career in my mid-40s. And I thought, well, what do I love doing in the golf industry that I'd like to do more of now? And it was public speaking. Because you mentioned emceeing, Warrington TEDx. Yeah. Well, I used to MC prize givings in the golf industry, and I really liked that. So I have a microphone in front of me now, so I'm happy when I'm near a microphone.
You're in your happy
I'm
place.
In my element. So I thought, well, I'll become a speaker. That's what I'd like to do. And I was introduced to TED Talks. Thought, well, I'd like to do one of those. But it's really hard to make a living as a speaker initially unless you're already famous for something, walking on the moon or winning a gold medal or something. And I hadn't done any of those things. I had a very sheltered life. Yeah. So I started to help business people to present better. Because there is an enduring problem with death by PowerPoint. We know that the level of business presentations isn't great across the board. But as well as the normal mechanical difficulties of reading from the slides and not projecting your voice and all the things we've seen people do wrong over the years, I kind of sensed that what they had to say wasn't very interesting. I know that's unkind to hear, but
true.
But what I mean is that they weren't doing justice to what they could say about their company, their product, their service, or themselves. And that's really how I got into storytelling. They didn't have a story to tell, which is where our work aligns in a way, because I think we're complementing each other in the sense that you're involved in PR in a more kind of traditional sense of the word, and I'm involved in what you call verbal PR.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. Going back to when Viva first started, I went on that kind of traditional route of turning up to the opening of an envelope. Every networking event I could get to, I was there. And the format in a lot of them is very similar, where you've got a 60-second slot to do your elevator pitch, and you get told how to do that, but like you said, so often it was so dull, and people really weren't doing themselves justice, and myself included, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I do remember one pitch I tried once, because I went to a BNI meeting many years ago. One of those early morning breakfast things where you're trying to wake up and say something reasonably coherent
over a bacon butter.
And I stood up as a guest and I said, could everybody just think for a minute about what the next score would be in this football results sequence? And I said, Manchester United 4, Tottenham Hotspur, and somebody said 0. I said, well, why did you know it was 0? He said, well, your voice changed. Your voice went down. And do you remember James Alexander Gordon, who used to read the classified football results out on the BBC for years? I mean, he's gone now, but he had this extraordinary way of doing it. And we used to play a game of guessing what the next number was going to be based on the musicality in his voice. Yeah. And he was asked, how did he come up with this way of speaking? He said, well, all I do is I think about what it would feel like to be on the winning side when I read their number out, or the losing side when I read their number out. So it just goes to show that it isn't just what you say, it's how you say it that really matters. You can do justice to the words that you say because of how you articulate them and the musicality in your voice or the emphasis. And that was the point that I made in that BNI pitch. And I met someone 7 years later. He said, oh, you're the guy who read the football results.
So it worked.
So there are lots of different ways of saying the same thing. So in many respects, that sums up the work I do now. I help people say things in unusual ways that is still consistent with what they want to get across.
Well, we're jumping ahead there. So we've got to this crossroads in your life. You've decided you want to be a public speaker. So what happened next? Where have you been since 2008?
Well, I started like many people do, getting small pieces of work, local, regional networking events. Wasn't really earning much of a living, but it was okay. And I had a breakthrough because somebody who I formed a business partnership, and we were doing this together for a while, and we'd given this individual a little bit of work ourselves because we didn't think we could take it on, and he must have wanted to return the favor, because he sent me an email one day saying, Andrew, would you like to do a piece of work in Switzerland for this Swiss company? They're a global company and they want somebody to talk about storytelling. So I had to go to Zurich after having bid for the work. I was up against 2 other companies, one in America, one in Canada, I think, but I got the gig. And I had to speak to 60 corporate salespeople for 60 minutes about storytelling. And it must have gone well, because I got 17 workshops from them after that, in New York, in Chicago, in Kansas City, and in Munich and Zurich and London. Wow. Because of that one 60-minute talk, which my friend David put me up for.
So that's a proper breakthrough there.
That was a real breakthrough. And then he said, do you want to work with the European Parliament? Because he's done some work with them. And then he said, do you want to work with PwC? So I've been working with PwC, now Pricewaterhouse as they used to be, for about 7 years. And I coach a course called Storytelling as an Influencing Skill. That
probably takes us to that intersection, because this is in quotes, a PR podcast, and we've discussed verbal PR. How do you think the work you do connects with what we do here as an agency? Well,
I think our work is very aligned, because you're trying to help your clients do justice to what they want to get across. So they obviously want to differentiate themselves from their rivals. They want to give people a sense that they can be trusted, that they're good at what they do. So you'll always be on the hunt for examples, case studies, interesting stories that will engage their audience through your advice. And I'm doing the same thing. So you've almost got a mixture of what I would call the big picture stuff. So they might want to get across their vision, their values, their purpose as an organization. But I think the magic often lies in the small stories, the little illustrations that they are living out those big things. Because if you only ever talk about the big stuff, it's not very tangible. Yeah. It's a bit fluffy for some people. It's a bit amorphous and doesn't really have shape and form and specificity. But if you can talk about little examples that illustrate that you're good at that, because it shows that you're good rather than you saying that you're good, I think that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think there's definite parallels there. We talk a lot in our world about thought leadership and doing thought leadership campaigns for the leaders of our respective organisations. And thought leadership can be very kind of highbrow and full of particular, very worthy but perhaps grey or dull statements. But to really bring it alive, you've got to have that personality and
Absolutely.
bring that personality
Absolutely.
into it, and you do that through those little kind of.
And there's a sequence that I often advise them to use when they're speaking verbally. Let's say they're on a stage and they're able to get across who they are. I have a thing called a 3-layered cake, which means the top layer is, as we said, the big picture stuff. Yeah. The lower layer is the library, all the little stories, the little illustrations. And the middle layer is the machinery, which is the essential facts and structural explanation of where you're based, how many staff have you got, what sort of clients do you have, that kind of thing. So the sequence that you often see great speakers use is they'll hook an audience with something from the library layer. Yeah. They'll start small and you're drawn in. You think, well, this is interesting. I identify with this character in the story and so forth, but I wonder where he's going with this. And then they'll jump to, and I mention this because to me, this illustrates what we're all about as an organization, which is this. Yeah. So they'll jump from the lower layer to the top layer, the big picture stuff. But then they've got to get to the machinery and say, well, let me explain how this all works in practice. And then they might go into some of the structural stuff. And it's a really nice sequence to use.
You've painted a great picture there already. And again, and it goes back to this verbal PR that you've managed there in a little kind of 60 seconds to explain that. You talked earlier about your first big breakthrough was to talk about the importance of storytelling. What did you know about it then? And what have you learned since? And why is storytelling so important?
Well, I think I got my storytelling gene from my mother, my now dearly departed mother, because she was always a great storyteller. So I think I've had it in me. And I was always in awe of people who could hold an audience, when they were sharing an anecdote of some kind. I used to watch, this is going back for people of my vintage who were listening to Parkinson. Yeah. Michael Parkinson, the BBC, the series on a Saturday evening, I think it was after Match of the Day or something. I used to love listening to the great storytellers, the raconteurs, the Peter Ustinos and people like that who could just hold an audience. And I thought, well, I'd love to do that. So then I started learning about what they were doing that made that effective. Yeah. And then in a way, I sort of moved that into the business arena to say, well, how can we maintain that level of professionalism and we're not an entertainer, but we still need to get a message across in an engaging way. So how can we tread that line between being engaging, but also professional and getting a message across in a way that, is memorable and has impact? Yeah. So it's very much about drawing on performers. I always loved the way that people are able to hold an audience, whether they're a musician or an actor or whatever, and how can we translate that into the business world and still make it, informative and professional, but at the same time, even slightly entertaining.
How has that landed with the business community, that whole thought and process? Have you had any kind of challenge or pushback on that?
Yeah, the pushback you often get is that things like, the people we deal with have very short attention spans. They don't have time for any of this fluffy story nonsense. And yet the best influencers are always good storytellers. Yeah. So I think they assume that storytelling means spending a lot more time delivering unnecessary fluffy stuff, and it doesn't mean that at all. So I think that storytelling is equally about using a good metaphor or an analogy. I consider that to be a piece of storytelling in the sense that it's framing a message in a really effective and an efficient way. So that's one objection. The other objection would be, I don't have any stories. Nothing interesting ever happens to me. Well, that's because they're blind. They don't see all the richness in the little mini micro experiences that they're having that they can use to help them make a point. Yeah. And then they'll say, I'm rubbish at telling stories, in the same way that people say they're rubbish at telling jokes. Well, you have to practice. You have to practice, and then you'll get better at that like any other skill. So these are common objections, which I think stem from maybe a fear that they're going into the unknown a bit by changing the way that they communicate, which would normally be very dry and very factual and very transactional and very logical, into getting them to communicate like a regular human being, like they would do in the pub or over dinner.
You've got me thinking there. I mean, a lot of the audiences that we deal with work in the engineering world, and I'm generalising for effect here, so forgive me if you are an engineer, but they tend to kind of bristle at the idea of their world being used in metaphors they run away from.
Yes, or dumbed down.
Dumbed down.
If it's dumbed down, or if it's not, I've got to give a full explanation to do my job properly.
Yeah.
And one of the best examples, I mean, you'll know this from your copywriting expertise, but one of the best examples of this I read in a book once was it's almost like a parable. It was an American tourist who was on holiday in India, and he's walking along the road and he sees this sort of wood carving guy who's carving these amazing wooden elephants out of a single block of wood, and they're beautiful pieces of art, and he's in awe of this guy. And he says, just incredible. How do you do this? I just can't understand. How do you do this? And the guy said, well, it's quite straightforward, really. All I do is I remove all the bits that don't look like an elephant. And isn't that a great illustration of the less is more principle?
Absolutely.
That you strip out anything that's not really necessary and you get to the essence of the message, which is enough for most people. And then if they want more, they'll pull more out of you. So I think it's best not to overload people from the beginning because they'll switch off. But if you tease them a little bit and give them enough that makes them intrigued, that's a great place to have people.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to where you are now, what are the kind of core principles of communications that your clients typically need to master?
Well, I think the main skill that I help them with is building a library.
Right.
And I don't just mean a library of stories. I mean a library of, I call them parcels of wisdom. So there might be anecdotes, there might be case studies, there might be counter-arguments, there might be quotations, there might be analogies, metaphors, which they can, and they build up like a stockpile of material that they can then use either in a pre-planned sense. They'll say, well, I'll start this presentation with that metaphor or with that story, or they can draw from it in an improvised sense, in a conversation. So salespeople are always taught to anticipate certain objections that they'll commonly get. So they've got the answer ready in their library, but they don't know when they're going to need it because they don't know when the objection is going to come, but it's there ready. So I think what you've got to do is you've got to build a stock of material so if the first time you're ever saying something is in the moment, then you're probably not going to articulate it very well because you've never kind of formed the best way of saying it before. So if you can draw from this and make it sound fresh and not just like a canned response, I think that's an incredible, I call it rehearsed spontaneity.
We're getting some good and bad examples of that this year because this is the year of the election.
Yes.
So we're having all these political debates. We've had lots of examples of politicians who were drilled to within an inch of their life on this. Can you be over-prepared? We've seen examples of under-prepared, but can it become anodyne if you...
I think, do you remember when Theresa May was Prime Minister? I think she was campaigning and it was all about strong and stable government. This was the line that she trotted out over and over and over again. And when you hear it, not strong and stable government again. Or Keir Starmer's, my father was a tool maker. It becomes almost a parody.
Yeah.
Because they've clearly been told to say that line over and over again. And I guess the principle there is that if you keep saying the same thing over and over again, it'll start to lodge and it'll work. But I think people see through what you're trying to do and become a bit tired of it, really.
You called it rehearsed spontaneity, that you can say the same thing, but you've got to make it sound as though it's the first time you've ever said it. And
I mean, I've told you that Zurich story. I told you hundreds of times, but I hope it didn't sound canned and like I was just trotting off the same old stuff. I mean, I still feel something about when I'm drawing off that experience because it was a really important experience.
Why is it that such knowledgeable people, you think, find it so difficult? You deal with captains of industry and real high flyers, but they find this stuff really difficult.
Well, I'd push back slightly there, Tony, because the people who I think tend to do this well have got to the top because that's helped them get to the top, this storytelling skill. The people I mostly help are on the way to the top.
Okay.
They are the future leaders. They are the middling professionals who are probably next in line to become a partner in a big law firm or a big accountancy firm. But they don't quite have the chops yet to communicate in a way that will get them to that next level. So I think the ones who have got there are often quite good at this. Some of them think they're very good and they're not good. But they've still managed to get to the top somehow. But no, it's the ones who are on the way who I mostly work with.
Let's think about the audiences that people are talking to. And how important is it to kind of adapt and change the story depending on the audience?
I was talking to a group yesterday. It was just a small business owner group primarily, about the blindness that sometimes comes from being very passionate about your product or your service. So all you ever do is you want to talk about you.
Yeah.
So the message is inwardly focused. I want to project this story to people about my business that's great and we love what we do. We're passionate about what we do. And the audience is sitting there thinking, yeah, but do I feature in this at all? So I think the main issue really, and it's a great maxim of public speaking, is it's not about you, it's about the audience. So to hook people, you've got to really hit them between the eyes very, very early on with some kind of grabber where they think, do you know what, I need to listen to this. I see myself in this.
Which kind of takes us to slightly tangential, but the TED Talk, you've done 3 now. I really tip my hat to you. Like doing 1 is amazing, but doing...
Well, the first one wasn't great. I'm very critical of the first one because I hadn't done much public speaking at that point and I hadn't really... develop my craft or my message. The second one was better. The third one I'm quite pleased with. That was in 2016. But I got into it because I was just asked initially to speak at Warwick University because there were some students that were organising the event and I'd helped them or somebody who knew the organiser of TEDx Warwick was the first one I ever did, which is the one I'm not particularly proud of. It was okay, but it wasn't great. And then latterly, I've been asked there's a lovely lady called Kirsty James who runs a networking organisation near Lymm in Cheshire called Colony Networking. And she has the licence to run TEDx Warrington. So she said, would you consider emceeing it? So that I'm almost going back to my golfing roots there of emceeing. I have to resist saying, and in first place with a score of 36 points. No, it's not that one, Andrew.
We love a good TED Talk here at Viva. They're fascinating, they're inspiring, they impart great knowledge. Are there any that anybody listening here you would point to and say, you've got to watch that?
Well, there is. The one I always used to cite was the most popular one of all time, which was by Sir Ken Robinson. Again, sadly no longer with us, about Do Schools Kill Creativity? But there's one more recently which I came across, which is not a particularly well-known one, by a guy with a great name. He's called Dean Ambrosi. Sounds like a rice pudding, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Dean Ambrosi. And he talks about the dangers of social media addiction and excessive screen time, particularly amongst the younger generation, amongst Gen Z. But I think we're all guilty of going down that rabbit hole sometimes. But what he opens with, we talked about opening like a grabber. He actually has a screen. If you visualize like a PowerPoint slide in a landscape format, and each month of your adult life is a dot on the screen. So you've got rows and rows and rows of dots. And he starts to explain how the average 18-year-old is likely to fill those dots with what they're doing. So you'll be asleep for a certain number of those dots. You'll be at work for a certain number of those, studying, essential hygiene, bathroom, so forth, cooking, cleaning, that kind of thing. And then there's the rest. And the rest is the time, the precious, sacred time that we have available to us in our lives to make our mark on the world. It will shape, the kind of person that we become. It shapes our character and all our relationships and so forth. And he said, if the average 18-year-old continues to behave in the way that they're behaving now, these are the number of dots that will be filled with looking at a screen. And it's something like 90% or something. And the audience gasps. You can hear the reaction of the audience. And I actually use that clip sometimes to talk about data storytelling, because it's a very clever way of visually using data to make an impactful point rather than just relying on logic and stats. He actually gets the audience reaction because he's built up the sacredness of this spare time that we have available. and this is how we're going to spend it if we carry on the way we are.
Sunday morning hacker golfers like me watch the pros. We're trying to pick up tips off the TV. Do you watch TEDx in the same and TED Talks in the same way as like trying to add to your library, if you will?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the thing with the library is you don't want it to be a static stock of material, because A, you probably won't have enough. And B, you'll get bored saying the same things every day. So it's great when you need to be hoovering things up and always having your sort of antennae twitching and think, oh, that's interesting. Because that's what observational comedians do. That's what journalists do. They're never off in a way. They're always kind of on the lookout for stuff, but they don't quite know how they're going to use it yet. So they have to reflect on it a bit and figure out an angle or whatever. So yes, always interested.
Going back to the kind of networking and B&I days, if you were in those circles now, what advice would you give to somebody who had just had a 5-minute presentation to give and they were listening to this now?
I would say I think there was a great piece of advice I got from Seth Godin, one of my favorite gurus, the New York-based marketing guru. And he said the purpose of an elevator pitch is to trigger a conversation. It's to say something that doesn't say everything, but it intrigues people to want to know more. So I think if you try and say everything in that 30 seconds or 45 seconds and cram it all in, it's not very effective. And if you're using lots of abstract language and descriptions that are very commonplace and everybody says the same thing, that's probably not the thing to do. It's safe, but it's forgettable, and you don't want to be forgettable. You also don't want to be crazy, so people think, oh, that's ridiculous. So you don't want to be unprofessional. But so if you can tread that line between saying something which is unusual and engaging, but which has a serious or a profound point of some kind, I think you've done a great job then of getting that impact.
And how do you, in essence, draw that out of people? Because what you're saying is that most of us have that about us. We have those stories, we have those anecdotes, we have that life experience to draw in, and that professional knowledge to kind of blend together. What's the technique?
Well, let me give you an example from yesterday. How about this? Is fresh out of the oven, this one. So there was a lady called Chloe yesterday who I met at this business event that I went to. And she represents a company that I think gives, really good business consultancy. They'll help startups get off the ground and put a good plan in place and a strategy and so forth. But I mean, lots of other organizations do that. But she told me that she's really into and always has been into horses, and she loves horses. And she said once she bought a horse that only had one eye, and no one else wanted it. So I'm thinking, oh, poor thing. So she bought this horse. It wasn't really expected to live very long because I guess if it's got one eye, it's good. I don't know. Its life expectancy and quality of life expectancy was not great. But she said, nonetheless, she bought it. And she said she wanted to give however long it had left its best possible experience, the best life that it could have with whatever it had left. And it lived for 10 years after she'd bought it. So it struck me that it's not a million miles away from a story she could tell about a business that maybe nobody else is interested in, but maybe they see some potential in it. But it's got to be nurtured, and you've got to give it the best possible chance of getting off the ground. So it's not a million. I mean, I think in metaphor and an analogy. And it just struck me that there was a link she could have used then, which would have got something unusual across. She then links it to a serious point which people can sort of recognize, oh, yeah, it is about business. And I think that would have been very memorable.
I'll remember the one-eyed
horse. Yeah.
All day. And that will probably be the thing I go home and tell my wife about. So what kind of key tools that the people need and do you help give them, do you think?
Well, a lot of the work at the moment I'm doing is in workshop format. So, and a lot of it's overseas. So I will go away, I'll do a 1 or a 2 day workshop, and then I'll come home and I may never see them again, which I often find is unfortunate. And I'm very, very keen to know how they get on, but I have at least equipped them with some techniques and some tips that they can start to implement in their work. But what I always say to them is that if you're a dry, factual, logical communicator now, and maybe slightly on the introverted side, you're not suddenly going to become, a Tony Robbins standing on the stage like the master of the universe. And you don't try and go all the way, but just take some baby steps. Just try some of these techniques out and maybe practice them first in a safe environment and then wheel them out, in a real environment and just see how it goes. Don't try and change too much too quickly.
Yeah, and I guess it's got to be authentic to you anyway. This idea of like a transformation just doesn't seem to.
If you come on stage, I say on stage, maybe in a boardroom pitching situation, let's say, or in a meeting, and you suddenly do something which is completely out of character. Because Andrew told me to do this, and then people will see right through it, and you'll feel very uncomfortable doing it. So you've got to try and. You've got to make sure that it's still coming from an authentic place. Yeah. And it's something you might normally say in a social situation. But if you can convert it into that business context and deliver it in a way that's, still quite confident and well expressed, and people will accept in that situation, I think you can pull that off. This
role as speech guru is taking you on a really interesting journey, hasn't it?
Well, it has. It has, yeah. I mean, I did a video the other day. I put it out on LinkedIn. And my partner says, it's too long, cut it down. I couldn't get it down to less than 10 minutes. Well, I did, because LinkedIn only accepts a video of up to 10 minutes. Right. So I got it down to 9 minutes, 57 seconds. But it was charting, that reinvention of mine. And the premise of the video was essentially that it is possible to reinvent yourself in midlife or even later in life. And I mentioned a guy called Rick Beato. Rick, I don't know whether you're into music, Tony, but Rick Beato has probably the most successful YouTube channel for music in the world. He's got about 4.5 million subscribers. It's Beato. And he's my age. I'm 62 tomorrow. He's 62 now. Wow. So I'm slightly younger than he is. And he only started his YouTube channel, I think, in 2015, after a career in music and music production and music teaching. But he said that the main skill he's had to develop over the years is to become a good storyteller. So I really related to his, because he's done a 6-minute video of his life. And because he's the same age, and because he sort of said that storytelling was the thing that he now has learned to do, I thought, well, I'll link it in with Rick and do a similar thing. So that's why I did that video.
Where has this journey taken you, both geographically and fundamentally?
Gosh, that's a deep question. I think it's made me a lot more confident, because I think I've become more curious. I'm very interested in things. And I think curiosity is a wonderful trait to develop. And I would really encourage young people as well to develop that skill of curiosity, and business owners to develop the skill of curiosity and not be blinded by what I want to say to the world.
That's a real tick in the box here, because curiosity is one of our core values we claim.
Yeah. So I think I've become more curious. I think I've become better at articulating what I want to get across. And I think I've also had to learn to coach people in something that I can do well, but I can't just say to them, well, just do it like this. It's like some of the great footballers who've become managers and coaches and can't do it because they can't get someone else who's less able maybe than they are. Yeah. You can't say, well, just do it like so. If when I'm coaching people, I can't say, just feel the story. What do you mean, feel it? So I've had to learn to give people structures and templates. But obviously warn them of the danger of coming across as very mechanical. You've still got to say something that might have a nice structure in a way that sounds, human and conversational.
Is there any analogy there with your past life teaching golf to amateur hackers like myself? The frustration on the other side must be, why are they still doing it?
Well, I think not so much teaching golf, but learning golf, because I'm still learning. I still harbour a hope that one day I might refine my golfing technique because I play quite well still. I'm off about, maybe 4 or 5 handicap now, so not bad. But I'm still searching. So I think the link between that and what I do now is probably habits. So there is a saying, obviously, that practice makes perfect, but I was corrected once by a teaching pro who said, no, Andrew, practice makes permanent. So in other words, if you practice the wrong thing, you'll embed or ingrain a bad fault. And that could apply for the way you sit, the way you eat, the way you drink, the way you brush your teeth, the way you listen. If you keep doing the same thing that's not great, it's a very hard thing to get rid of.
Yeah, that's one of the downsides of being born in 1966 or whatever. These things do come ingrained.
Yeah. So that therefore needs to, I think it lends itself to taking some coaching from somebody who can see you from a different perspective and point out certain things that you're maybe not doing as well as you could do, like how you're listening, how you're expressing yourself, how you're holding yourself. So, personal development always starts with a realization that you have some room for improvement, but sometimes you need that other perspective to help you identify what it is that you need to improve and how you need to improve it. Because
you went on this kind of real change in direction. Have you ever had that voice on your shoulder saying, what are you doing here, Andrew? You're going to get found out, but you really are the golf guy. Well,
I've been doing this for so long now that I think that a lot of people don't know about my golfing background, so that I have managed to transition successfully in that sense. But I'll go back to the Zurich thing, the story I didn't tell you about that. I felt massive imposter syndrome because I was recommended by somebody who was very highly regarded internationally. I thought, well, I better not mess this up because his reputation's on the line because he's recommended me. So I was under pressure. And I happened to mention in my 60 Minutes there about Simon Sinek's now famous Start With Why thing. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be aware of this, the three circles, the why, the how, and the what.
The legend of Simon.
Yes. Now internationally renowned thought leader, leadership guru and so forth. So anyway, the boss of the company I was doing this talk for came up to me at the end, and I'm sort of steeling myself, thinking, God, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was all right. And he said, very well done, Andrew. That was great. Well done. And he said, I really like that thing you mentioned about the circles. And I thought, that's a shame, because that was the only thing that wasn't my idea. I did obviously mention it was Simon Sinek because he'd influenced me. That's why I mentioned it. And I thought, And then he said something very, very funny to me. He said, we asked Simon Sinek to give this talk, but he was too expensive. And I was temporarily discombobulated by that comment. I thought, how am I going to process that? And I took it as an enormous compliment to be mentioned in the same breath as somebody who I held in enormous regard. So I'm the cheap version. This is the way I process this.
The cut price Simon.
No, I really admire him. He's a fantastic communicator. He could be talking absolute nonsense and you'd still believe what he was saying. So I think he's a great example of how you say things really matters. I'm not saying that what he says is nonsense. It's not. It's a lot of really good wisdom in Sinek's material. But no, he's a really, really good speaker.
It's fascinating that because that TED Talk, which is one of the best seen ones as well, it's a terrible recording.
It's a dreadful recording. So his microphone didn't work properly. Somebody replaced it midstream. He had a flip chart where he scribbled his circles on, so no fancy PowerPoint. And do you know how many people were in the room for that talk? There were about 50 people. It was a tiny event. It was barely more than I had yesterday in my little local business group. But it's become an incredibly influential, whatever it was, 16, 18 minutes.
Let's kind of wrap up now. Then just reflecting on the kind of golden lessons that either you've learned or that you can impart onto your audiences, that something we can leave our audience with.
I would say that learn from people who are really good at what you want to be better at. So I modelled myself as a golfer on some people who I really admired, which was my brother and some other players like Jack Nicklaus and Seve Ballesteros, who did certain things really, really well. So I wouldn't copy Seve if I wanted to learn how to drive the ball straight, because he wasn't known as a very accurate driver, but he had a great short game. So I'd focus on that. Similarly with public speaking, if you want to be good at let's say using humor in a serious business area, watch how Ken Robinson did that in his now famous TED Talk. That sort of light and shade. So model yourself on people who do a specific thing really, really well. Or if it's the way they speak, or if it's their body language or something. And it might be that there's a boss that you have or a leader that you admire that I'd like to be like them a little bit. And then obviously you've got to find your own way of being still authentic.
That's a great way of wrapping things up. But before we go, I've got one last question. Producer Dan wouldn't let me leave the room without asking this one question. Producer Dan has just taken up the great sport of golf. And he said, ask Andrew if he got any tips for me as a rank new player. What should I be doing?
Well, he's in for a lifetime of pain if he's taken up this game. Psychological abuse. I was lucky because I had a brother as a pro 10 years older than me, and he taught me good fundamentals. So you can see all sorts of fancy techniques on YouTube with gadgets and this and that. But at the end of the day, if you have a good grip and you have a good stance and you have a good basic swing and posture, that will take you a long way. And don't ignore the short game. People practice a lot at driving ranges and want to hit the ball a long way, but actually you make your score really around the greens.
Excellent. Put that in your golfing library, Producer Dan. And on that, thank you so much, Andrew. That's been a fabulous chat. I hope everybody out there has enjoyed it as much as I have.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.